In this video, we're going to discuss narratological creativity. Now, narratological is a big word that comes to us from the word narrative. And all narrative means is the sequence of a story, putting things together in an order that we see how things make sense. We see new things, plot and theme and character. And it's actually a pretty difficult cognitive operation in order to do this. It's a pretty high-level creative skill. And you know this if you've ever seen a small child try and tell a story. Things are out of sequence and people appear and disappear in the wrong order. Or if you've ever seen somebody who's clumsy with telling a joke that's maybe got a longer setup so that when they tell the punchline, it's kind of no longer in the right timing and it's no longer in the right sequence. So getting a story right and getting a story to actually be creative is actually very complicated to do. So let's look at 3 narratological creativity techniques. The first is called storyboarding, which is basically what they do in the movie making business to move scenes around, to get the story to make more sense, to be more interesting, to make it pop. The second are what are called morphologies, and all morphologies are combinations of characteristics and functions and attributes that are deconstructed and then reconstructed like Lego. The third are what are called scenario making techniques, and these are making stories or lines of stories to see what is possible, what is the range of possibility of what could be happening going forward. So let's start by looking at the idea of storyboarding. Now, we're not going to talk about storyboarding the same way that maybe a Hollywood producer would, where we're moving all the scenes around, we're cutting scenes, putting characters in, etc. We're going to look at it in a way that's more functional in our life. So I want to actually talk about making a storyboard about storyboarding. The first thing every storyboard has to have is the main idea. What is the reason why we're storyboarding? What is the purpose? And from the main idea, what you need to generate first are the headers. What are the uses of a storyboard? What are the types of storyboard that we might use? What are the materials we need for storyboarding? What are the rules about storyboarding? What are the roles we're going to play in storyboarding? And what we're going to do is under each of these headers, we're going to do some brainstorming. And the brainstorming is going to take all these ideas, we're going to cluster them together to see what kind of patterns we come up with. And the ideas that basically cluster together the most are going to be the most prominent ideas of the storyboard. So let's start with the purpose. So let's say, for sake of discussion or example, the purpose of this storyboard is to solve problems. Well, then what becomes the uses of a storyboard? Well, it could be creative thinking, could be putting ideas together, could be bringing groups together, could be having a shared vision of things. What are the types of storyboards? Well, we could have a physical storyboard, and we could have one that's in a digital environment where people do it across the net. We could use Post-it notes. We could use note cards. We could use flip charts in our materials. What are some of the roles we could play? We could have somebody be the facilitator. We could have people be participants. We could have outsiders come in and add to our storyboard, right? And what are the rules about storyboarding? Well, the rules could be one person talks at a time, or one idea at a time, or everybody calls their idea out loud when they have an idea. And from this, we're going to create this sort of range of things that we could be doing, and looking at the entire pattern, at the entire storyboard, we're going to identify what the best ideas are, and most importantly, how they go together. And what a storyboard allows us to do is to combine and recombine ideas indefinitely. So if you made a storyboard and you hung it in the hallway of the place that you work, and let's say you use Post-it notes, people could add Post-it notes, they could move Post-it notes around. Let's say you did it in a digital environment where people could actually add or subtract things online. Say, I've got a better idea, they can hitchhike on these ideas. So the object of a storyboard is it's creating a vision of how everything goes together. It's a work in progress, and it's something that has a bit of democracy to it where everybody can participate. So think of it like it's making a movie about what you're trying to create. It's your own movie, your personal movie, or the movie that you've made with the people that you're working creatively with. A second technique for narratological creativity are what are called morphologies. And morphology is kind of a fancy word that you would find usually in a field like biology or in a field like the study of languages. And morphologies basically look at the elements that go into something and how those elements can be combined. So I want you to think for a minute about what you learned in school about phylum. And then there's, species, and then there's genus. There are orders to things. And that's what morphologies do for us. They give us orders of things. But they also allow us to look at how individual pieces of things might go together in a new way. So think of it like Lego or building blocks. We could put things together in a very different combination and we could come up with something very different. So for example, let's assume that we're trying to make a new type of a handbag. We're in the business of making fashionable handbags. Well, we could look at what kind of material the handbag could be made out of. It could be made out of cotton or leather. It could be made out of silk. And then we might say, well, what kind of a handbag might we be making? So let's say we might make a clutch, or we might make a duffel bag, or we might make some kind of a backpack. Well, we could look at the colors that it could come in. We might want to make it orange or red or green. And finally, we might want to look at something like style. Is this something that's more kind of punkish, or is it something that's more preppy-ish? And what we can do by playing around with these individual attributes is we can combine them in different ways to make different kinds of handbags. We could also add to it textures, we could add uses, we could add all kinds of things. But by listing all the possibilities and then by connecting them in different combinations, you could come up with a wide array of handbags that you could develop. And ultimately, when you compared all of them together, you might be able to run some tests and discover what are the 2 or 3 handbags that really are going to sell. What's the next fashion thing that's really going to take off? You can do a morphology around things that are scientific. You can do around things that are more emotional, like service or how people feel when they come to your coffee shop. You can do these around the functions of things, like how a car should work or how a transaction should work at a bank. The object is very simple. Try and list out all the basic attributes or functions or characteristics of something, and then list them all in detail in sort of a list order, and then look at them together and figure out what combinations you think are going to have the best prospect of being successful. A third narratological creativity technique is scenario making, which of course is an Italian word for a thumbnail sketch of a story, sort of an outline of a story. And this is often used by strategists. Now, whether the strategist is trying to make an energy policy or figure out how to sell more of a soft drink, it has to do with the wide variety of stories that may come true. And what they're trying to consider is what we might call the best case and the worst case scenario, or more accurately put, sort of the range of things that really could happen. Now remember, there's no data on the future, so one of the things you do with scenarios is you start out by looking at drivers. So let's assume, for example, we're a municipality and we're trying to prepare ourselves for emergencies. Now, we're going to ask ourselves what kind of things would drive an emergency under any scenario. These are things that are likely to happen, but we don't know when they're going to happen, and they're likely to happen because they've happened before. So, for example, obviously, at the top of the list would be weather calamities. There might be a tornado or a flood or a hurricane. Another one might be something like government regulations. It might be something like our ability to provide shelter and infrastructure. Are there roads to get to the places? Is there water in the places that we would need? And what we're going to do is we're going to create these 3 scenarios. And the object of scenarios isn't just to say best case and worst case. The object of scenarios is to look at the range of cases. So what we're trying to do is to say what could happen. So what would happen if it was a tornado? What would happen if it was a hurricane? What would happen if it was a flood? What would happen in those scenarios? And what you're going to do is you're going to fill in the rows for what would happen under those scenarios. And then what's going to happen is when you tally up the columns, you're going to create stories. So there's a story where something is going to happen and we have to move to shelters. There's a story where something's going to happen and we have to evacuate the town. There's a story, something's going to happen and we need to call the neighboring cities for emergency and rescue. But the object of all of these stories is when we look at all of these stories together, we're trying to determine 2 things. What are the most probable outcomes that we're going to look at, and which outcomes are going to have the highest impact? Probability and impact. And that becomes the basis of our strategy. That becomes the basis of what we're planning for, because it's highly probable and it would have a high impact. But we're also going to look at a range of possibilities of things that are less probable and have less of an impact. The thing about scenario making is it's always a work in progress. So there's always going to be adjustments because new things are happening all the time. And because it's event-driven, things that we didn't think could happen maybe could happen. Maybe something has happened in the meantime. Most importantly, scenario making is highly ambiguous. It's a very complex array of possibilities. So on a regular basis, you need to tell the story of the scenario over and over to different people, and the story gets better, the story gets different, the story changes over time. So this is not something you do once and you leave it. This is something that's living. You have to do it on a regular basis, because what you're really trying to do is you're trying to help groups of people make sense, make creative sense out of things that are very complex, very emerging, and ever-changing. So 3 narratological creativity techniques include storyboarding, morphologies, and scenario making. In the next video, we're going to explore the highest level of creativity, and that is intuitive creativity.